Okay, hello and welcome to your video lecture on surveys. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. All right, so here we are. Now, surveys, hopefully a somewhat familiar concept, which means that hopefully this will be a simple and straightforward mini lecture for you. Surveys, so when I'm talking about surveys, we are talking about what is often, it's usually a more quantitative rather than qualitative methodology, although this one can be a little bit of both. And we're somewhat familiar with surveys, right? This is something like a questionnaire. Sometimes, after you finish, using a certain product and they say, like, can we send you a survey? Customer satisfaction. And we also see a lot of use of surveys in political seasons, right? So kind of they'll conduct political opinion surveys to try to predict elections, sometimes successfully, oftentimes not so successfully. But this is really kind of through this political surveying of populations is one of the places where surveys really get into kind of the popular lexicon and where we see them a lot, because there will be a lot of surveys conducted about which way people are going to vote, but also about things like attitudes and beliefs. And some of these large scale surveys that are taken also help us kind of comprehend how attitudes and beliefs and behaviors have changed over time amidst a given population. So we have here on the slide, surveys help us do things like measure attitudes, opinions, and orientations, beliefs, leanings, ponderings. They tend to help provide data in a uniform format. So what that usually means is if I'm asking a survey and there's a set number of response to a given question, then I'm able to do quite a bit of mathematical statistical work with that data. It's a little bit complicated kind of how we get there. And unfortunately, we won't, in the confines of this class, we don't have a ton of time to get into the how of doing that. But what we can know is that surveys can help us get some really uniform, some data that's in a uniform format, and we can get data from a large amount of respondents. Right, so today, most surveys, I would say probably most surveys are conducted using the internet, which does pose some problems, as you might imagine, but in previous time, there were mailed surveys, right? They would mail out surveys and hope that a certain amount of people actually responded to them. I don't think that would work super well today. And then surveys can be conducted over the phone as well. That does still take place today, but it's increasingly unpopular because of the difficulty of getting people on the phone, of tracking down cell phone numbers. Right, so there was a period of time where researchers could use literally a phone book and say, we're going to call every fifth person on this list and see who picks up and ask each of those people our survey, and that'll be our random sample of people that we're asking. So today, many surveys are conducted online, and they can provide us with a ton of data. Again, so if I ask 100 people a survey question, I can very quickly see, what did people answer to question number one? Oh, 25 out of those 100 people picked option C for question number one. And so depending on what I'm asking, that can give me some real quick and juicy data. Like I said, it's mostly quantitative, but it can be qualitative. And I'll talk about how and why in a moment. The other term that is going to pop up a few times in today's lecture, and which I will introduce in detail, a little more detail at the end, is sampling. Okay, sampling is how we go about finding the people to respond to these surveys. Okay, so there are different tactics different sampling tactics that can help make a survey kind of more or less generalizable. So basically, there are tactics that can help us make it kind of a more a survey that could be recreated time and time again. Remember, you studied in some of your reading. We didn't spend a ton of time on it, but you did read a little bit about generalizability and reliability. Surveys can be quite generalizable, depending on how you sample, how you pick who is going to answer to your survey. So as I'm talking through this lecture, you can keep in mind the idea that whenever we think about creating a survey, we need to also think about, like, literally, logistically, how am I going to get people to answer this? Because we all know not that many of us like to click on and answer these surveys, right? So you need to be thinking about realistic logistics if you are saying that you're going to conduct a survey, especially when it comes to writing a proposal. If you say, "Oh, I'm going to get 1,000 people to respond to this," I'm I someone reading that would want details about how you're going to get to those people and how you're going to decide, and how you're going to reach people and what the limits of that are. It's okay that there are limits. We just need to acknowledge them. So typically, when we put together a survey, you're going to start from that process of conceptualization and operationalization. So I'm going to start from the big ideas that I want to get my hands on, and then I'm going to operationalize them and turn them into really usable variables. Okay, and at this point in the semester, we've talked about that a lot, and it's always helpful to go back and review that information. Um, some really common variables in a survey would be things like age, education, or income level. So that can be literally, what is your age? Fill in the blank. Or it can be, what is your age? Under 18, 18 to 65, and over 65. I'm sure you've all seen questions like that where really all the researchers wanted to know was, are you a child? Are you an adult? Or are you an elder? Same thing with education. It can be, how many years of schooling did you complete? Write it in. Or it can be, what was the highest level, what's the highest degree you've completed? And again, I'm sure we've all seen that question on a survey somewhere, right? Less than high school diploma, some college, then maybe it will say 4-year college degree, then it will say master's or professional degree, and so on and so forth. So when you do a survey, that process of operationalization is really important, because you're going to want to put some significant time into thinking about what are the variables I'm really trying to measure, and making them as clear as possible for people without leading language. Okay, again, another example of a variable often answered would be income. So this can be done in brackets. It can be, do you make less than 50K a year, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, over 200, whatever. However you decided to do it based on the logic of your survey. The other thing, so some of those first few that I went through in terms of variables that often pop up on a survey, the other thing that surveys often try to measure are opinions. Now, opinions, that's something, some of those other things I just mentioned, we can get that from census data or something, which is fine. We can do some statistics with that. Opinions, there's some large scale data out there that already exists about social opinions. But if I'm doing a smaller survey, I'm probably interested in people's opinions or attitudes or maybe experiences. So one example that's on the screen would be, you could ask people's opinion on capital punishment. And so a lot of times you see in surveys these questions that say, what is your opinion on capital punishment? And the options are strongly support, neutral, or not sure, could be like the middle category. And then disagree, or do not support, and then strongly disagree. So that's kind of a really common scale for opinion type questions on a survey. Now, I've previously done with with a live and in-person version of class, what an opinion survey amongst Mercy College students, or amongst college students in a given environment, to say, what have your opinions been on the response of the school to the pandemic, for example. And so we would come up with 10 or 15 questions related to that. And there's quite a span and quite a variety of questions that one can come up with, and then go out and actually ask students. So maybe you're looking at getting 70 or 80 or 100 responses to a question like that, but you still get some pretty interesting opinion data. And so you can say, well, 30% of students actually don't feel safe coming on campus anymore. Or 40% of students prefer some sort of in-person component to their classes. And then you could ask follow-up questions that said, well, so what stops people from signing up for those, or all types of things, right? So when you do ask survey questions, you want to make sure you're asking questions that people can answer. You're not expecting the respondents necessarily to do like analysis for you. They're not doing your research project for you. They're just telling you a little bit about their lives, their beliefs, and their opinions. Okay, survey items can be formatted in different ways. One common way is questions, right? What is your opinion on capital punishment? Phrased as a question. But you also see survey questions that are phrased as statements. And that can be something like, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Capital punishment is morally wrong. And then you can have people answer, I strongly agree, neutral or not sure, disagree, strongly disagree. And so that in both of these two examples that I said, questions and statements, well, usually that means there's a question or a statement, and then there's options to pick from. They just fill in the bubble or circle it or whatever. So those would be what we would call close-ended questions or statements. The other way to phrase kind of survey items would be to have open-ended questions, or more uncommonly, much less commonly, open-ended statements. But an open-ended question could be something like, tell us about your opinion of capital punishment, and you can just let people go from there. That's probably not when you'd really use that open-ended format with, although you could. But in doing a survey of students existing amidst the pandemic, you could conclude with some open-ended questions that say, what has your experience been like in recent years? Or, what do you feel like the school has done well? And then what do you feel like the school has done not so well? And you could just let people kind of go to town. So these open-ended survey questions tend to yield a little bit more of that qualitative data rather than the quantitative data. Okay, so remember that regular surveys that are close-ended, these can give us some great quantitative data, because if I say, ask a question and I say, oh, well, 20% of respondents picked option B for this question, that's right there. That's some quantitative data that I'm using and some info. But you can't do that with open-ended questions, right? You can't say 20% of people really said anything, because everybody's going to give a different response. Okay, so when you're designing a survey, you would want to think about, am I going to use questions, statements, and then am I going to use close-ended? Usually I would say this is probably more common, either to have most of the questions be close-ended or even all of them. And then you would say, where am I going to have open-ended questions? A really common practice is to have a bunch of close-ended questions with a few open-ended ones at the end. And again, I'm sure that you have seen surveys like this, even something like if you like unsubscribe from an email list and it says, why are you leaving us? And then it gives, a couple of options, and you click on one if you bother to fill it out. And then maybe there's even a follow-up, like a bottom question that says, what can we do better, or something like that. This would be really common uses of surveys. But in the social sciences, we're usually, taking a kind of a broader view. Some tips for surveys: you definitely want to use short items, short, nice, clear sentences. You don't want different respondents to be different levels of confused as they're reading these questions. So as clear cut and succinct as possible. You want to avoid using negatives. So if someone has to, like, you don't want to ask, why don't, let me think of an example. you don't want people to have to kind of use a double negative to describe their feelings, which means you would not want to ask, what do you dislike about coffee or something, because it can become very confusing for people. You would want to, first of all, use something more neutral, like what are your opinions on coffee? But if you were going to describe it, rather than saying, I don't support, let's say there's a law, I'm going to call it law number 3, just randomly. And you don't want to say, what is bad about law number 3, right? You would want to say, tell me a little bit about your opinions about law number 3. Or you would want to say, well, what do you like about law number 2, right? Especially if it's something that it's one or the other. So if you're asking someone, why are you a Democrat or why are you a Republican? You wouldn't want to say, why aren't you a Republican? You would want to say, why are you a Democrat? There we go. There's the example. So you want to avoid negatives because they can be very confusing for people. You also want to avoid double-barreled questions. That means questions where there's like implicitly 2 questions actually rolled into one. So that would be like, do you support the new anti-abortion legislation in Texas? And if not, why not? Because actually that's 2 questions. So this comes up a lot, even though it sounds kind of ridiculous when I say it and give the example, like, oh, of course we wouldn't do that. But it actually comes up a lot when writing questions. You want to make sure that each question is really only asking people one thing. Like, so you don't want to say, do you feel if you're sick, you should be able to call out of work, and why? That's 2 questions in one. So you're just going to want to separate out every little question, right? So sometimes the way we do that is we'll ask a question, let's say a yes or no question, and then the next question after that will be, if you answered yes to the question above, here's your new question. If you answered no, you can skip this. Or if you answered no to the question above, here's your new question. The last point here is really critical for surveys, which is to use neutral, unbiased terms. Okay, so some examples are on the next slide. There's a lot of terms that have taken on kind of a negative connotation, or take on heavily politicized connotations. And so this is the case. You want to use neutral terminology, even if you kind of agree with, even if you feel a particular way about a certain term or a certain policy or a certain group, you want to make sure that your survey is as neutral as possible. And the reason for that is not that we need to like remain neutral, right? As a matter of fact, most of the time, many times social scientists are trying to gather data because they feel strongly about a given topic, but your science will be skewed and therefore less impactful if you have very forceful language one way or the other. So you don't want to be accused of kind of like skewing your audience, like, and this happens all the time, right? And it's really, really common in social media right now. It's really, really common. You'll see like just bizarrely worded surveys where, I don't want to say anything that's going to just like randomly trigger people. But though this happens a lot when we're talking about the debates about abortion, right? So you'll see surveys that are like, do you support the the killing of babies? And it's just like, well, if you phrase it like that, you're going to get some very skewed results on this particular social conversation, right? So you want to be careful, even if you feel a certain type of way about a particular conversation or social issue, you want to be careful that your language is as neutral as possible so that you can get clear results. Because ultimately knowing more about how people really feel about a topic is helpful, right? So some examples that might come up, the term welfare became very politically loaded in the United States in the 80s and 90s, to the point that it's often politicized in a way that has a negative connotation. So you may want to avoid that terminology because a lot of a lot of readers and a lot of voters have been politicized, and most especially kind of amongst more conservative factions. A lot of voters have been socialized and politicized to view welfare as a negative, as a bad thing, or as something that like leeches on taxpayers, right? Something that says specific, that is a little bit broader, like assistance to the poor, is probably going to give you different results and is a more neutral terminology. Cops has also become like a politicized term. So even if you feel like that's valid, we're going to get accurate information, you're going to want to use the most neutral term you can come up with. A lot of times that can be something like law enforcement. Same thing with rehab. The idea of rehab has kind of been given a negative social connotation. So you would want to kind of give a more neutral terminology or neutral phrase of something like dealing with drug addiction. Our language matters a lot. And when I hear this a lot, and I see it a lot when we're writing out interview questions and survey questions, you want to be as clear and as neutral as possible in these questions, because ultimately that will give you stronger data to back up your social and political beliefs with some data that's really well grounded. One of our big problems right now is that there's not a lot of that. There's not a lot of kind of scientific work necessarily being done. And then people pass things off as science that really are not. So this can be really helpful. Your format matters. Okay, so some common kind of survey question formats: yes or no question, beautiful, nice and clear. But this only works for something that can only have a yes or no answer. Are you currently enrolled at Mercy College? Yes or no, right? That's a nice, clear question. But if you ask, if you ask something like, do you have a degree from Mercy College? You might actually, and just say yes or no. That would be okay. That question should technically be okay. But it might cause some confusion for students who are like, well, I'm a current student. Does that count? Or it might cause some confusion for people that say like, well, I finished, 90% of my degree, but I'm missing a few credits. Like, what do you want to know from me? So be careful with your yes or no questions. Multiple choice questions, also nice and clear. But again, make sure there's an option for everyone, right? So you probably don't want to ask like, hey, are you comfortable coming back to campus, okay, to take in-person classes? Yes or no? Because a good amount of people might feel like there's not really an option for them there. Like a lot of people are going to feel like, yes, sort of, or yes, I am, if there's certain measures in place or with caveats. So you want to be as clear as possible. With multiple choice, excuse me. You also have scale questions. So these are often literally kind of on a 1 to 4 or maybe a 1 to 5 scale. And this is something like on a scale from 1 to 4, with 1 being the least and 4 being the most. How comfortable do you feel being in a classroom at Mercy College right now? And people can answer where they feel on that scale. And then you can ask, how comfortable would you feel if there was no mask requirement? And people can answer. And you could say, oh, look, see, there's a discrepancy there. Okay. A contingency question is similar to what I described before, where I say there's a starting question, and based on your answer, your next question is different. Okay. So that would mean, again, if you said you had a yes or no question to start, and then if the person clicks no, it takes them to one set of follow-up questions. If a person clicks yes, it takes them to a different set. And finally, a matrix is basically a very complicated set of contingency questions, where basically it builds out, right? So every time you answer a question, you're going to go one direction or the other, and then you're going to answer again, and it's going to take you somewhere else, and then it's going to take you somewhere else, right? So a matrix would basically be a very complex set of contingency questions. So again, if you're going to tell me in a proposal that you're doing a survey, I'm going to want to know all of these details about what type of survey. I'm going to want a few sample questions attached, and I'm going to want to know who you're talking to. Okay, and I'm going to want to know the advantages and disadvantages that you feel surveys have. Some advantages to a survey is that you can typically get more respondents, especially compared to interviews. This is just logistics, right? Even at a small level, it's a lot easier to get 100 people to fill out an online survey than it is to sit down and interview 100 people. That's logistically very difficult. So a survey, you can get more respondents. It can be more generalizable, which I spoke about at the beginning of the video. It can also be more reliable. So that means it can be recreated more easily, and it can be, you can take the sample and say that it applies to other places or applies to other populations more easily. And that's because it's more respondents and it's bigger. Okay. So if I go to a remote community or neighborhood and I interview 10 people and I do participant observation, I have all this amazing thick description data of that community and I write this great article about it, that's fantastic. But a lot of people are going to say like, that's interesting, but it's not generalizable to a lot of other places, right? Like you can't take that same view of the world and say, oh, it's probably similar to other groups. When I do a survey, not that you can totally generalize it, but it can be a little bit more generalizable because the sample is bigger. The disadvantages are that surveys are not flexible. So unlike interviews, where remember we said if you're in an interview, you can kind of go with the flow most of the time, especially a semi-structured or unstructured interview. You can base your next kind of line of questioning off what people are saying, and you can kind of feel it out a little bit. You can also see people's social cues. Surveys, you can't do that, right? The questions are set, everybody's going to get it. And if you get a bunch of responses you weren't expecting, you can adjust right then in the moment. Surveys are also not as in-depth because for the same reasons, questions are set. There's only so much you can really ask people, especially because you want to get people to respond, so it can't be like a 2-hour long survey. And their surveys can be less valid. This is because there's less validity, meaning there's a lot more wiggle room, especially because people can say whatever they want in a survey, right? So as compared to participant observation, where you can contextualize and see for yourself and view kind of like an array of evidence to back up what people say and what they do. In a survey, people can basically are able to kind of say whatever they prefer. So it's not always super valid, meaning you can't necessarily always verify the information. Okay, I mentioned this earlier, when you're doing a survey in particular, and also in some other forums, especially interviews, people are going to start to ask you how you are sampling or where you're getting your sample from. This means literally how are you going about selecting people to participate in your study? Like who's getting the email with the survey link? Okay, there's a separate video on sampling, but I want us to think about a few things even here at the end of this. When you start thinking about a survey, the first thing you're going to think about in terms of who gets it is what is your unit of analysis? What is being studied? Is it individuals? Is it institutions? Or is it countries or some bigger group? Usually we do surveys with individuals, but occasionally you'll have something like a survey of nonprofit organizations where the unit of analysis is actually the nonprofit itself. For most of us, I suspect that the unit of analysis for a survey we would be conducting would be individual people. But you'd want to think then about what is the population you're interested in. So demographically, age, racial and ethnic background, gender, zip code, location, any other characteristic. I keep talking about this example of doing survey of Mercy College students. So if that's what I were doing, then my population would be people currently enrolled in Mercy College, all age groups, all racial and ethnic backgrounds, all genders, but the kind of qualifying trait of my population would be that they are currently enrolled in Mercy, right? That would be different than if I were doing a survey of Mercy College alumni, where all the other demographics would be the same, but I would say the specific kind of population trait is that they once were enrolled in Mercy College and they no longer are. Okay, you would then want to, if that's your population, you then want to know who you're going to sample from that population. Meaning, if I'm doing a survey of Mercy College students, current Mercy College students, my population is people enrolled in Mercy College, but I'm not going to be able to talk to every single person. First of all, it's logistically impossible. It's not super practical, and it's just it's not necessarily helpful, right? So how am I going to get a sample from that population that keeps me away from being too biased? So if you're watching this and you're thinking, well, I would just ask my friends, that's not it, right? Because that's going to bias your sample quite a bit. And even if you're thinking something more neutral, like, well, I guess I could just stand on the corner and ask whatever Mercy College student passed to fill out a survey, that is a legitimate sampling technique, but it has its pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses like others. So you will see the next video, which is on sampling and different sampling techniques. It is critical that if you are using interviews, surveys, interviews and surveys, basically, that you also have a sampling technique to justify how you're going to find these people, how you're deciding who you're talking to and who's getting sent the survey or who's getting the phone call or who's getting asked, can I interview you? So pay close attention to that because it will come up for almost all of you. Okay, and that's it for our survey video, and we are done.